Well, I made some mistakes with my first draft, which is to be expected. That's what first drafts are for. First of all, I had a few no-goes at the deepest tier of my class talents. Divinity would be okay, maybe as a passive at the shallowest part of prod, except then it would be a must-have for Holy. Conviction is... it's ramp-up time, that's what it is. They took it out at the end of Cataclysm for a reason, and I should not have put it back in, let alone at the deepest part of the tree. Divine Strength isn't bad, but it should probably be some midway talent, halfway between Protection and Retribution, instead of way deep like I had it in my first draft. I should take what I had in Tier 9 and put it in Tier 10 and take the stuff out that doesn't make sense. Next, when I asked for feedback about my first draft, they told me that Holy Shock would be a must-have for Retribution if I had it as the shallowest talent in Holy's column in the class talent tree. Holy Shock would do more damage than Crusader Strike, and there are, in fact, gaps in Retribution's rotation that Holy Shock would fit right into. The funny thing is, I'd been worried that Holy Shock would be a must-have for Protection since I didn't know about those gaps, but in any case, Holy Shock, it's going straight into the Holy Spec talents as the base. Another thing, Lay on Hands shouldn't have been as deep as I put it, no matter how powerful it is. Neither should Divine Shield be deep. Either they should be baseline or they should be extremely shallow in the trees. I'm leaning in the direction of making Divine Shield baseline and making Lay on Hands the new root of Holy's column in place of Holy Shock. The thought being that if there's even one healing spell that Retribution or Protection might want to cast, it's Lay on Hands. Some part of me thinks maybe Lay on Hands should have been baselined as well, but for now, I'll put it at the base of Holy's column. They also warned me that Beacon was extremely unlikely to be revamped into a damage for healing mechanic, which is disappointing but realistic. I'll put that into the Holy Spec tree in the middle of Tier 2, and in the class tree I think I'll put Light of Dawn at Tier 3, and believe it or not, Cleanse Toxins at Tier 2. I'm putting it there because Druids surprisingly have their dispels as talents. Some part of me thinks it would have been wiser if Remove Corruption were a baseline ability and then there were a passive in the Restoration Spec tree where it could be upgraded to dispel magic debuffs, but if that's not how Blizzard's going to roll, then I'd put Cleanse Toxins at Tier 2 in Holy's column and then have a fairly shallow Holy Spec talent to upgrade it to Cleanse so that it can dispel magic debuffs as well as poisons and diseases. Maybe if the player goes a little further down Holy's column, they could get a passive that would buff the healing of Word of Glory, or maybe even of the hardcast heals like Flash of Light and Holy Light. I think I'll keep Light's Hammer deep in Holy's column, but I'll put it at the deepest part. Aura Mastery would be partway up. As for Denounce, for now I'm putting it right in between Holy and Retribution. It's meant to be highly skippable and super shallow. I figured Denounce should be easy to get for any spec that wants it, and that edge cases might exist where Retribution or Protection might want a ranged damage spell with no cooldown, even if it is hardcast. Denounce coming back was one of the things that I got positive feedback about. Having a damage spell with no cooldown is so much more fun than not having one. Though again, Denounce is skippable. Melee playstyles probably wouldn't be willing to hardcast it. Speaking of hard casting, you might think that Holy Light would be a good pick for the shallowest part of Holy's column, but I've got other plans for Holy Light in Holy's Spec talent tree. The short version is, only a Holy Paladin who's specializing in hard casting heals would even want Holy Light on their spell bar, and since it doesn't feel good to have to spend talent points on things you don't want, players who choose the hard casting playstyle should be the only ones who even have Holy Light on their spell bars. But back to the class tree. There aren't that many Holy-specific abilities if we're being honest. I could throw Holy Prism in here, since I didn't have a place for it in the Holy Spec tree in my first draft. But then again, Retribution has gaps in their rotation, so I can't really put it in between Retribution and Holy without making it a must-have for Retribution, so into the Holy Spec tree it goes. I had thought about putting Avenging Wrath in between Holy and Retribution as well, but since Protection uses it as well, probably it should be baseline. On Retribution's column, my first draft had both Divine Storm and Templar's Verdict shallow in Retribution's column, the thinking being that Protection and Holy could use some hard-hitting finishers if they spec for it. Shield of the Righteous has its positive aspects, but high damage is not one of them, unless there are a lot of targets. Then I thought, no, having both Divine Storm and Templar's Verdict in the class tree is too much. One should be in the class tree and one should be in the Retribution spec tree. So I've decided to toss Divine Storm back into Retribution spec tree and instead have a Zealot's Escutcheon talent, shallow and highly skippable right next to Protection's column, that'll bring Shield of the Righteous's damage up to something that's at least noticeably above what the Holy Power builders deal so that it's not unsatisfying to cast it. But that does put it on the global cooldown, so Protection will likely only ever use this talent while soloing. But again, it's highly skippable. With this talent in place, there's a talent for a single-target Holy Power finisher, and a talent for a multi-target Holy Power finisher, without drawing too much out of Retribution's spec talent tree. Now, I've realized something needs to be at the deepest part of Retribution's column, so I figure something single-target is best. Light's Hammer and Holy Wrath were both multi-targets, so what are my options here? Justicar's Vengeance is lackluster compared to Templar's Verdict unless you've got the target stunned, so I guess it's got its niche, but it's the best I could think of. The second best is a modified Execution Sentence that deals escalating damage over time like it did in Mists of Pandaria. Shield of Vengeance, I had that in Retribution's column in my first draft, but now I'm seeing it's wiser to have Divine Protection be baseline and then have talents and protections and Retributions trees that turn it into Ardent Defender and Shield of Vengeance, respectively. It kind of feels like there should be one more damage ability in Retribution's column, but again, my options are limited. Wake of Ashes, Final Reckoning, and Blade of Justice seem like they belong in Retribution's spec tree. I guess Execution Sentence, again modified, is a possibility, so I think what's going to happen is I'll have Execution Sentence deep in Retribution's column, and then have a skippable Justicar's Vengeance, probably right next to Divine Strength, which will be more or less a must-have. I also put Hand of Hindrance in the class tree because it looks like a decent ability and interesting enough to have in Retribution's column. And I chose Hammer of Wrath for the root of Retribution's column because I figured it would be one of the first Retribution abilities any Paladin would want, and it should be easy to get, though I wouldn't say no to baselining Hammer of Wrath. Then again, the fact that there aren't that many damage abilities means there'd probably be one less damage ability in Retribution's column if Hammer of Wrath were baselined. I don't know if that's a problem per se, but I figured I should bring it up. You know, we could go after some discarded Retribution concepts if we really wanted to flesh out the column. For example, Turalyons Might was a talent from Legion's Alpha that quickly disappeared to the point where players never got to have fun with it in a live game. Here's how Turalyons Might worked. You targeted the ground and you threw a holy sword at whatever ground you targeted. That sword would pulse out damage over time to nearby enemies, Light's Hammer style. If you cast Turalyons Might again while the sword was still out, you'd charge to the sword and do some damage. So that would be a charge ability of some kind which Paladins currently lack. And Exorcism could make some kind of comeback for Retribution. Blade of Justice has filled the niche that Exorcism once filled, but maybe Exorcism could come back in some other form, maybe as a ranged damage spell on a short cooldown that doesn't interact with anything else, or maybe as a Paladin version of Frost Death Knight's Howling Blast spell, a ranged damage spell that we only use if a particular proc kicks in. I don't know. If we had something like that, probably it should be in Retribution's spec tree instead of the class tree. As for Protection's column, I kept Hammer of the Righteous at the lowest tier because I figured Retribution might want to pick it up as a multi-target holy power building substitute for Crusader Strike, with which it shares charges and cooldown. For that matter, Holy might want to pick up Hammer of the Righteous for when they're soloing. I figure that if Divine Shield is baseline, then Blessing of Protection should be in the class tree really, really low. Unfortunately, one of the things about Protection is that it doesn't have all that many damage abilities besides the baseline ones. Consecration is baseline, Judgment is baseline, Shield of the Righteous is baseline. Blessed Hammer would look amazing, but it's a replacement for Hammer of the Righteous, so maybe it doesn't belong in the class tree. I mean, I guess it could be a skippable talent in the class tree right over near Zealot's Escutcheon. Okay, I just talked myself into adding it in. Now, Avenger's Shield definitely belongs in the protection spec tree, so as far as the deepest talent in the protection column goes, I think I'll stick to an unpruned Holy Wrath spell, at least for now. I suppose Blessing of Spell Warding is a possibility for what to put in a protection column, since we need something interesting in there. I toyed with the idea of putting Hand of Reckoning in the class tree, but I'm not sure it belongs there. I think it might be wiser to have Hand of Reckoning be baseline, like Dark Command was for Death Knights. Sad to say, mostly it's going to be passives in the protection column. I guess Blessing of Salvation could be unpruned in here, and I'm not talking about the long-term buff that was annoying if you didn't have it, that was Greater Blessing of Salvation in the Burning Crusade. I'm talking about the anti-taunt that Hand of Salvation was in Wrath of the Lich King. I'd also thought about unpruning Eye of Tyr, which was the Legion artifact weapon ability for protection, but maybe that would be better in protection spec tree, maybe even as a deepest talent, I don't know. It just about goes without saying that Rebuke is going to be shallow in between protection and retribution. And I figure Blinding Light and Repentance should be an octagonal pick-one talent somewhere in the middle, ideally as a talent with no prerequisites, so that any Paladin can pick either of those if they like. On the subject of talents with no prerequisites, there's exactly one talent without prerequisites in all the talents that Blizzard has shown us as of the time I'm writing this, that isn't at the shallowest tier, that is, and that is Tiger Dash and Wild Charge smack dab in the middle of the Druid tree. Talents with no prerequisites create a huge amount of player freedom, and I am so crossing my fingers that Blizzard aims or will aim to have 3 of these kinds of things per class, with edge cases going as low as 2 as a bare bones minimum. I am so hoping that Blizzard isn't thinking, well, this no prerequisite talent in the middle of the Druid class tree is an edge case. We don't like no prerequisite talents, because that means way less player freedom for us. Blizzard needs to think about how they're going to please the players, and handing us the building blocks of our class and then putting in too many restrictions on how we can assemble those building blocks, it just defeats the purpose of handing us those building blocks in the first place. Plus, it just isn't fun. In a lot of ways, it feels like there are too many restrictions. There's no way to get Abomination Limb as a Death Knight without going full blood in the class talent tree, for example. There would be if there were some talents with no prerequisites that fed into the center talents. Not all no prerequisite talents need to have arrows coming out of them, but it's helpful when there are. Or if there were crossover paths that let you start in one column and jump to another column, it would also be possible to get Abomination Limb without committing fully to the blood column. I'd like to see those real crossover paths added, ways players can have real freedom to switch columns, preferably at least twice during their progression. Player freedom is going to be important in Dragonflight, and I think it makes sense to let players hybridize. Druids have that hybridization a little, though less than I like. There's no way to start on the far left and reach the far right, or vice versa, without going all the way down another column. Though anyone can start anywhere and end up in the middle, all thanks to that freedom-enabling, no prerequisite Tiger Dash / Wild Charge Octagon talent in the middle that I so very much hope Blizzard sees as the new normal rather than a special case outlier. That was quite a rant. One last thing. My first ideal class talent draft had the talents on a wraparound map so that Holy could connect to Protection and Retribution, Retribution could connect to Protection and Holy, and Protection could connect to Retribution and Holy. And the player could scroll around so any column that they feel like is displayed in the middle. I'm not sure how difficult it would be for the UI team to implement something like this, but it would create a huge amount of player freedom, especially if Blizzard were invested in crossover paths, which they don't seem to be, at least not yet. Since the whole wraparound UI probably won't happen in Dragonflight, I've mothballed that concept. Maybe Blizzard can take it in the next expansion after Dragonflight, but probably not in Dragonflight. So with this draft, I have Protection way over on the left, Retribution in the middle, and Holy way over on the right. I think this works reasonably well. That about covers what I'd like to see in the class tree. The next video will be all about the spec tree. Please let me know what you think of this second draft of mine of the Paladin class talents.